Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. We're gonna start or restart the new session of the regular PoSoCoMeS seminar. And just a few words about the discussion we're gonna have today, this evening. And this is the discussion of the book, which is Museums of Communism, New Memory Sites in Central and Eastern Europe. And Stephen Norris is the co-editor of this book. And Beata Nessel-Łukasik kindly agreed to be discussant today. So my name is Maria Matskiewicz, and I'm part of the PoSoCoMeS seminar organizing committee. And the procedure of today's work is following. I'm gonna briefly present the participants, the presenter and the discussant, and then we have the session of questions and comments between Beata and Steve, and then we have time for questions and answers from the audience. And of course, you can leave your comments and questions from the very beginning on the chat, but please, we can wait till the end of the seminar, and usually it lasts about 1 hour and a half or something about that. And let me introduce briefly our participants. So Stephen Norris is the Walter Hewikhurst Professor of Russian History and Director of the Hewikhurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies at Miami University, Ohio. He is the author of 3 books, including blockbuster History in the New Russia, Movies, Memory, Patriotism, and the editor or co-editor of 6 other books, including Museums of Communism and New Memory Sites in Central and Eastern Europe. He is currently writing a biography of the Soviet political caricaturist Boris Yefimov entitled Communism Cartoonist: The Extraordinary Lives and the Death of Boris Yefimov. Beata Nessel-Łukasik is an art historian, sociologist who graduated PhD of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, and now works at the Maria Grigorievska University in Warsaw. Her work focuses on the impact of social changes on contemporary museums and various groups of audiences. As a museologist, he was associated with the Warsaw National Museum and Józef Pilsudski Museum and Sully-Jurek, where she created the first local program department in Poland, and as co-author Sully-Jurek Social Archives and the Relational Museum on the Threshold Beyond the Threshold, Museology New Places, 2020, sorry. She also edited 2 other volumes as author in an interdisciplinary monograph, Memory Coalitions, the program Excellent Learning Monograph 2022-2023, and as co-author Audiences in Museum, the National Institute of Museums, 2022. Currently, she is focused on the impact of polycrisis on museums in Poland, scholarship holder of the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage 2023. She is an ICOM member of Museology editorial team, and of the Artistic and Research Tellers Group. Well, I believe that we do not need to say more about the book, because I believe that everyone who joined us today at least knows something about the book, and we can delve into the more details with our discussant and presenter. So thank you, and we can proceed with the discussion.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your interaction, and also for inviting me to participate in today's seminary and to discuss about this very interesting book. Before we start discussing, I would like to share you with my own feelings about reading this book, if I only can. It is possible. It wouldn't be a short story, a long story, so only I will take you a few minutes about this. But I think it will be a good interaction, introduce to our discussion. So first of all, I would like to share with you with my own two experience. First of one took place in Romania in 2015. I was then visiting the Stiget Museum, which Claudia Dobre described as a theater of memory in 27. It is a museum monument to anti-communist victims and resistance, next to which there is the International Center for the Study of Communism. It was then that I first encountered the staging of memory and exposing communism as a regime unknown in the to Romanians, which was imposed on them by USSR. The second experience was happened this year when during the implementation of nationwide own research in museums, which also included institutions open over the last 2 years. This is how I came to the Karsit Soldiers Museum in Ostrołęka in Poland. It is a small village, but have a new museum. Next to the Warsaw Museum with a similar theme, deals of this topic that is the subject of our today's conversation. Over the course of several years between these two events, what happened in my life, as a researcher and museologist, I had the opportunity to encounter the type of modern museum more and more often. I think I was in more than 20 museums like that. A place created in a symbolic space, burdened with baggage from the past, in which, using very different media, even sometimes of old-fashioned games, viewers were invited to experience the musealization of communism. Book edited by Steve allows us to deepen the spectrum of effects of this process, which is over time and the emergence of subsequent museums of communism led to the emergence of one of the features that distinguish the course of the museum boom in the Central and Eastern Europe. What I mean here is the appropriation of symbolic space, which is every museum, by contemporary discourse of not only historical, but also political, and what is very important for me, social nature. Just 20 years ago, such activities in the space of institution, striving to expand their influence of democratization of both the cultural and memory sectors, seemed to be isolated situation in the public space. However, book edited by Steve and our authors and their history of 13 museums of this time documented in it fundamentally changed this perspective. After reading the first few chapters, which allow you to learn about the history of creation of such places in the territory of Baltic countries, as well as those belong to the Visegrad group, like Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic, or those located even farther to the east, like Ukrainian and even Georgian, the scale of phenomenon discussed by this author is to be a case study. Thanks to this, a foundation is laid for discussion the impact of this type of museum on the creation not only a few forms of staging memory, but above all, new approaches to key categories such as communism, victims, suffering, justice, and even nostalgia. It asks the question about the limits of the influence on contemporary politics on the autonomy of museums and the imagine of the past presented in them. What role do such institutions play, and what role could they play in shaping the identity process of individual nation groups and their heritage? Do these types of museums, which are still classified as historical museums, on the one hand, and are perceived as over important places of memory shape and educational policy that will allow future generations to develop a vision of communism that goes beyond black and white patterns? After reading your book, Steve, you may have many doubts about this. The example of communist museum present by authors, which in most cases were the produce of one particular authority in a given region of Central or Eastern Europe, created a collection of buildings, monuments, artifacts, stories, and even emotions that go beyond neutral and unladged version of history. Moreover, by raising issues relating to the most sensitive period, namely modern history, they created a space in which a whole spectrum of precisely directed situations are triggered to facilitate the stigmatization of the one and the same enemy, communism. All this calls into question whether modern museums are actually opening up to new social roles. Do they, as the author of the new definition of museum announced last year in Prague would like, offer us a safe space for engaging discourses about the influence of the past on the present, about its impact on our identity and memory? Thus, the example described by book edited by Norris provoke a conversation about really possibilities and potential of modern museum in this part of Europe and not only here. Are they able to function on a daily basis and institutions capable of contesting specific discourses of knowledge and power? But or are they rather a puppet? It is my favorite metaphor in a world that even Erving Goffman described more than half a century ago as a society of spectacle. And if so, what place and what role do they play in the theater of memory? So let's try to talk about this, Steve. It is a great pleasure to meet with you and have possibility to discuss about your book. At the beginning, I would like to ask you for a few words about the methodology because it is not clear for me in what way you choose this museums. Why this 13, not others? Could you tell us in which way you are selected them with other authors, of course?
Yes, thank you, Beata. That was a great introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I see a couple familiar names, so that's great. And new names, which is equally great. It's morning here, by the way, in Ohio. So if I say morning, there you go. I've just had my second cup of coffee. So to answer your question, Beata, first I want to answer it by explaining a little bit about the organization of the book for those who haven't read it. There are 14 chapters that have a total of 16 museums discussed in them. There's a couple chapters that have 2 museums discussed, including one on the Gulag museums in Kazakhstan. And it's organized around 5 different themes. And I actually set it up so that the book could be read and viewed almost like a museum itself. So there's different halls. There's 5 halls, much like you would find in a museum. The first is the Hall of Genocide, Occupation, and Terror, which has 5 museums discussed in it. The second is the Hall of National Tragedies, which has 2 museums, 1 memorial site as part of that discussed in it. The third is the Hall of Everyday Life, which also has 2 museums discussed in it, including the Czech Museum of Communism and the battle over the GDR, that is the Berlin's DDR Museum and the Stasi Museum. Then I have a separate hall of Russian memory, which I'm happy to discuss at some point for anyone who wonders why we separated Russia out. And then the last section is called Rotating Exhibits, which looks at 2 museums that have changed fundamentally from their original concept, including the Stalin Museum in Gori, Georgia. So that's just a short overview. I'm happy to discuss more about them. I have 3 answers, I guess, for how I set this book up and how I organized it and what places I decided to include. So the first is that this book grew out of a long-standing interest in historical memory and cultures of remembrance. I guess I developed this interest even in graduate school. One of my advisors was Alon Confino, who has written a lot about historical memory, and particularly argues, and something I take up in this book too, about how societies engage in what he calls cultures of remembrance, which is, I like that term remembrance even more than memory. Memory tends to suggest a fixed idea, whereas remembrance allows for a process, and how cultures of remembrance develop as opposed to how we wish they developed. That's something that Alon stresses in his book and that I hope this book captures too. So that's, I suppose most people develop books out of long-standing interest, so that's maybe not all that interesting. The second is really because I run this Havenhurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies, which you mentioned, and we were very active in the 2000s and 2010s in student workshops abroad, less so, of course, in this decade because of a pandemic and a war. So I was struck by how many places I visited with students and as part of these student groups that had new museums that we would tour through. And I thought, having gone to Vilnius and then Riga, Lviv, Kiev, Moscow, of course, where I've done a lot of research, just how many new museums there were. And that seemed like a potential subject for a book of this kind. And then, the last bit is that I participated in the Slavic World Congress in Japan in 2015 on a panel devoted to new museums, and another panel in New York City at Columbia University, also devoted to new communism museums, where I met Katya, Daria Mattingly, Muriel Blave, and Julie Fedor. So it was clear that there were other people out there that were interested in the same subject. So out of that confluence, those 3 different bits, the book developed. In terms of what was included and what wasn't, that mostly for anyone who's edited a book, you will know that sometimes things fall through. Sometimes you hope some places were covered that aren't. We actually had a chapter on a Romanian museum that fell through, the Pitești communist prison, which I wish had come through, but it didn't. I wish we also had one on a Slovakian museum. I know there's a museum of the crimes of communism in Bratislava, as well as a Bulgarian museum, although I did write a blog post when the book came out about 2 Bulgarian museums and how they dealt with the past. So we, even with that in mind, I think we tried to cover as many places as we could. So we made sure we had Central Asia covered. We had as many of the countries in Eastern and Central Europe covered as we could. And of course, Russia, insofar as that was possible. We had 4 separate museums covered. And therefore, I think even though I wish there were still more places covered, I'm pretty pleased with the way in which the scale and scope of the book, that is, I think we've hit all the different places and engaged with all the different ways that communism is being remembered in this part of the world. I'll say one more thing.
Okay.
For the audience out there, and that is I actually purchased the rights to the website museumsofcommunism.com using Squarespace. So I hope at some point, again, pandemic and wars have gotten in the way of making that alive and a really active site, but I'm hoping that this site can become something where people will write short pieces about museums that aren't covered in the book, and maybe just as importantly, people will visit some of the places in the book or have different takes on the way the authors in the book interpreted these museums and write short pieces for this website, because I think that's part of these cultures of remembrance. That is, it's part of a process and active engagement with the past. These museums will change, some have changed already, and I'd really like to document that.
Thank you very much for your answer, because I'm interested in it, because when I try to make some new research in museum only in Poland, it is always a hard decision in which way organize a group of institution which will be representative for the subject which I am interested in from some point. So it's really hard to find the best key to organize this workshop. On the other hand, you have a lot of part from literature in your book. For example, at the beginning, you offer us a metaphor suggesting that we could trade it as a suitcase full of museums. It is very interesting metaphor. On the other hand, chapter by chapter, by using this key which you described just a few minutes ago, you propose us stories that are more similar to each other than different, in my opinion. So could we say that there are some universal solution in case of creating Museum of Communism? Could we try to offer some model of this kind of museum, or it is a kind of fixed idea? It is impossible. What do you think about this?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Beata. So the metaphor you refer to, I open with Sergei Dovlatov's novel, short novel, The Suitcase, which he published in 1986 after he immigrated from the Soviet Union to New York City. And the whole basis of the novel is that he packs this suitcase with 8 items in it, and that's all he takes with him from the Soviet Union. He was allowed 3 bags, but he only needed 1. And it sits in his closet for 4 years before he opens it again. By the way, here, it just popped in my head, it occurred to me, this book came out in 2020. So one of the things I've done over the last week is look at this book again, initially with some fear. You publish something, it gets out in the world, and then you forget about it and hope there aren't any mistakes. And then you, in the case of this seminar, you open it up again and worry, oh my goodness, did I do anything terrible in this? I don't think so. I hope not. Anyway, and Dovlatov has 8 items in his suitcase, and he opens it after 4 years. And each item reminds him of his past and the previous life he had. So he writes how much memories engulfed him. And then the novel explores the 8 objects one by one. Socks, or one of them, boots, I think, a suit, and how he acquired them and how he helps them remember life in the Soviet Union. So I do open with this idea that, in a way, many of these new museums represent something like the opening up of stored memories, of suitcases of this kind, where memories engulf people and then become part of the basic stuff of new museums. And this idea of a suitcase full of memories is one where it takes a form of personal objects, much like Dovlatov, but also one where stored grievances are allowed public airing. And that, I think, is an important part, an important metaphor that helps explain the book. I'll also add here that there's a difference, I think, in terms of the second part of your question about whether or not the suitcase of memories really covers all of the museums that are discussed, many of which are about airing of grievances and very particular ideas about the past that blame everything on the other, like Tony Judd's famous phrase about the past being a foreign country. But there are differences, I think, between state-run museums and private museums. So there's a big difference, I think, in the way that the DDR museum operates in Berlin, the Museum of Communism in Prague, which has changed quite a bit over the last few years, and even the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games, which has a branch in Moscow and one in St. Petersburg, and even revamped old museums. The Stalin Museum of Gori, which Katrine Godfredson writes about, is quite an interesting case, because it can't just remain the same, in other words. And I guess I'd also return here to this notion of each of these museums, and each of them discussed in the chapters, are something like a snapshot in time. Most of the site visits took place in the 2010s. The book came out in 2020. So they all aim to capture the process of remembrance 20 to 25 years after communism ended.
Yes, that's true, but it's dependent on something which we could name as a process. It isn't a closed history. It is still very fresh, not only for people who coming to this type of museum, but also for people who created places like that. So it's full of emotion, full of different kinds of idea. But I'm interested why. I don't remember exactly where in your book, but there is mention this phrase, but it's like memory games. Why you use this term memory games? Because we are talking about institution. Most of them are public institution, financing by governments, different countries in Eastern and Central Europe. So why you use this term?
Yes, I think you're referring to the way that I mentioned Anthony Polonsky's piece on this, what he called the Suffering Olympics, and where he was quite critical. So he's a scholar of Poland and Polish memory, of course, and he was quite critical of the way that institutes of national memory, as well as some museums in Central and Eastern Europe, have tried to play what he calls the Suffering Olympics to compete for the country most victimized by the 20th century. And he sees this as particularly dangerous, or at least potentially dangerous, because in doing so, what many countries, he was referring to the Baltic countries, but also Poland, try to position their victimhood as one where they suffered both from Nazi and Soviet regimes, and therefore the entire population of these countries are entirely victims. So that's the idea of the game, and that actually captures the first section on the Hall of Genocide, Occupation, and Terror, the 5 museums discussed there, where at least initially in every form, each of these museums tried to focus on Soviet crimes against national populations and, punt, I guess it's an American metaphor. I watched football here yesterday, on the way in which those very same national populations helped participate in the Holocaust. So instead, the museums and the way that they try to narrate the past were to focus on 2 separate genocides that their country suffered as some sort of unofficial competition.
Yes.
Yes. But if I could also add to that, I set up the introduction so that there are 2. So I open with the Dovlatov metaphor that you mentioned, but there are also 2 docents, that is, guides to these museums of communism. The first is Slavenka Drakulik, of course, because she wrote a book called A Guided Tour Through the Museums of Communism, which was an inspiration for this book. Where that book is separated into 8 different chapters that are 8 fables, each meant to combat these new myths developing about life under communism, that is this notion of suffering entirely. And the second docent, similarly, is Oksana Zabushka, who wrote a very long novel called The Museum of Abandoned Secrets, where one of the characters calls out what she calls the bullshit version of history, where everyone was heroic or where grievances grew and they needed to be aired in public. So that's the sort of competition here. I mean that not as a, I mean that as a structure to help critically examine these museums in the book.
So we're coming back to a question, by whom this museum are produced. Yes, so what is the main issue why they want some group of people representing much more a group like national group decided to work on subject like that. Exactly, especially that they use very often, and these examples I think this kind of example were the most represented in your book. They organize it in historical buildings, which is for me from one hand very important, because this using a space, a memory of space, which is located and connected with the space, is very popular in museum. And of course, it is not dependent on only of Museum of Communism. But on the other hand, if we are talking about memory games, the risk that we started to be a puppet in the theater is growing up. So what do you think about using this kind of place by people who organize, who are responsible for creating a Museum of Communism in Eastern and Central Europe?
Yes, another great question. By the way, Beata, I hope you are willing to write something for this website that I mentioned earlier, because I'm fascinated by your take on the theater and your view on the space as well in buildings. But to answer the question, you're absolutely right. I mean, in many ways, we might look at certain chapters of this book as one where newly emergent independent countries are inherit buildings that are haunted or that are places of trauma, and have to ask themselves what they want to do with these places.
Yeah.
Do they want to tear them down? Do they want to build a museum in them? How do they want to use a site? And one of the most popular sites, of course, in the book are former KGB prisons and headquarters. So the one in the museum in Vilnius is, of course, the former KGB headquarters. Same for Riga. The Stasi Museum in Berlin, of course, uses the headquarters of the Stasi there. And the Gulag Museum Stephen Barnes talks about in his chapter on Kazakhstan are the actual museums. So place matters, I suppose. And at least initially, most of these museums put up exhibits that were part of this hall of suffering or genocide or occupation. That seemed to be the way in which newly independent countries wanted to narrate the communist past. That is, we were occupied by a foreign country, in this case, the Soviet Union / Russia. Often it's blamed on Russia. And here is this actual site, this building where the terror was enacted. All true, by the way. Oftentimes, however, and here I'm thinking particularly of the Vilnius Museum that my colleague Neringa Kulmbete wrote about quite well. The initial tendency was to focus entirely on the KGB and the NKVD as the agents of terror, and not the use of the very same building, say during the Holocaust, to round up local Jews, and where some of the very people who were victimized by the KGB or NKVD became victimizers in this other genocide. So that tended to be ignored. One of the other issues too is that I think Steve Barnes writes about quite well, and it's true of Russia as well, is that place matters, which is a way of saying that the Kazakh state inherited Gulag sites too, but they're very far away from Astana or Almaty or any place like that. In fact, very few people end up visiting the Karlog Museum, even though it's there. And I mean, Steve Barnes is one of the rare people who has. The only person I know, by the way, personally, who has visited these museums. So that matters too. How does one deal, in other words, with place centrally located and place not centrally located as a repository of memories and the potential site for some sort of museum that engages with remembrance practices. The other thing I can say about your question is, I'm particularly intrigued by sites like the Lonsky Museum in Lviv, which I wrote about, and even in the 9th Fort outside of Kaunas, Lithuania, where I visited with Neringa Kulmbete, because that's not in the book, by the way, but the Lonsky Museum was a former barracks in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was built as a barracks and then became useful as a prison for all kinds of different regimes. The Polish Republic used it as first a barracks, then a prison. The Soviets used it then as a prison when they occupied after 1939, and then the Nazis used it as a prison, and then the Soviets used it as a prison again. The Lonsky Museum, at least when I visited, and I assume it's still the case now, only focused on the 1941 massacres, where the NKVD, when they left the building, executed mostly Ukrainian nationalists who were housed in the prison, and remembers that incident, which of course did happen, at the expense of the use of the very same site to round up the local Jewish population, and of course, to place, enemies of the Polish regime as well. It's only the one regime that matters in this. Whereas the 9th Fort Museum outside of Kaunas actually acknowledges the fact, so that was a fort built by the Russian imperial government to fight World War I. It didn't really work very well as a fort, but it became a useful site again for imprisoning and housing populations across, the 1930s and 40s. So that is to say, across Nazi and Soviet regimes. And all of those stories are actually told pretty well in that museum. I'm really interested, in other words, in sites like these buildings that were built for one purpose, housing soldiers or protecting from invasions, that become sites where mass murder and genocide can happen in the very same site. In other words, these buildings were proved ideal for these horrific murders of people, murders of civilians in the 20th century.
It is
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Steve. For me, it is very hard decision. Where should we open the new museum? If we should use the genius loci of some space, because it's full of memories, different kinds of groups, and which groups will be represented in this new museum and which not be inside of this kind of institution, on one hand, and on the other, it is for me very hard to find the best solution about architecture, about creating a museum connecting not only with modern history, but also with trauma history, where we are not prepared to find the best way of express not only story, but our feelings. In place like that. I remember that in the past in Poland, several decades ago, was a big discussion about monument in Auschwitz camp. What form will be the best? And I remember that the project proposed by Oscar Hansen was not acceptable because it was without this figure of people. It was too simple. On the other hand, this open form, clear form, proposed us meeting with the history, with trauma, in some more natural space. Today we are still discuss about this, what we should do. Few weeks ago we opened a new historical museum in the center of Warsaw, where will be several historical museums very close to each other, and all of them are situated in the prison which functioned during 200 years in Warsaw, in the middle of the Warsaw. So the question is still open, I think so. There are not one answer for that, but I think that we should remember that there are a lot of consequences of choices like that. Using historical building, historical street, like street in Moscow, where you describe one of the museum which was situated at Lenin Street, Hitler Street, and now Freedom Street, and what we could do with whole story of the same places, yes, which several changed during decades in the past. But coming back to your book, because I have more questions, you know that about this, and we don't have a lot of time. So going forward, I would like also ask you about this influence of politics on this type of museum. What do you think about this kind of influence on modern museum? Because in the past, we thought about museums like a temple, like something what was not discussed. It was a symbol, it is a closed form. Nowadays, after museology changes in 80s, in 20th century, we have more possibilities to use. And here we are meet again with very big influence, for example, from political field to new museums. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I discovered in this book acknowledges what you just said, Beata, and that is to say how much politics influences museums, and not just in this part of the world, I should add. That is, there's always a story of negotiation between political actors and museum directors and citizens of separate countries. So, for example, one of the new museums in the Smithsonian complex here in the United States in Washington, D.C. is the Museum of African American History and Culture, which actually has a rough analogy, or it could act as a rough analogy to many of the museums in the book. That is, it came about because of more political awareness of the experience of African Americans in the United States history, much more openness about the traumas of this history. And interestingly, it's largely made up of objects from personal collections, because so many African American families kept hold of items, much like Dovlatov, let's say, and were afraid of giving them over to museums until they knew that they would be protected and displayed in the right sorts of ways. So that museum is and it's amazing, by the way. If you're ever in DC, you should visit it. But it's also an amazing example of the way in which political negotiations take place, and the way in which remembrance cultures develop across time. And then it turns out, of course, some of the the incredible objects on display in this museum are, like Harriet Tubman's Bible, which was possessed by a family and had not been seen because they didn't want to just give it up to the U.S. government that had, persecuted them in many ways. And now they felt like it was safe because it was a museum that acknowledged their experience. So I guess I open with that because I can return us now to our part of the world, which is that all of these new nations want to build a foundation out of the past, which makes it helps explain why so many of the initial museums took the name occupation museums. But it's also worth saying that at least in some places, the Baltic states in particular, these sites have evolved. It matters that Vilnius has renamed what was initially called the Museum of Genocide Victims to the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, which allows for a much more nuanced view of the past. If you call it the Museum of Genocide Victims, there's only one interpretation on display there. If you call it the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, you allow for much more complexity, a few more memories to be displayed. It also matters that Tallinn has renamed their occupation museum the Vabamu Occupation and Freedom Museum. And by contrast, it also matters that Hungary's House of Terror has remained the House of Terror. It's led what Mate Zambori, who wrote the chapter in the book about the House of Terror, it remains because it's led the way in what he calls the relative success of historical revisionism. That is a broader European acceptance of anti-communism, especially on the political right, and particularly associated with the Orban regime. It makes sense that the Orban regime wants this place to remain the place of terror and focus entirely on the way in which the Soviet Union damaged Hungary. And then finally, in terms of politics, there are a couple chapters and worth mentioning here about the way in which state-run institutes for memory have occupied or have become very Orwellian. That is, they've often policed public and official memory in order to stick to a particular interpretation of the past. One example is the way in which the Institute for Historical Memory in Poland has operated with the Law and Justice Party and even helped enact laws about the way in which one should view the past. That might change, of course, with the recent elections, which I'd be very interested in revisiting this topic at some point and seeing how, if at all, this has changed.
I'm asking about this because I remember a situation from a few months ago when a group of people who have own history about their families and communism and being on Siberia in the past decided to go to the new museum in Poland, which is situated in Białystok and which is dedicated this part of our history. And then when they come back home after this visiting in museum, they were very disappointed. It wasn't their part of the world. It wasn't the way where they find themselves in this stories, in this kind of narration. It was something outside of their stories, which are coming from one generation to another in their house. So we have a lot of problems with responsibility of creating narration, connecting with history, not only with modern history, but also which is more emotional, maybe not so good described by historian. On the other hand, we always have problem with the places where we meet with the part of history described in some way. And sometimes there are no place for us, for our stories, for our thinking about the past and the influence on this of our life today here in nowadays. So this political influence, which are more bigger nowadays, especially in Poland than several years ago, in my opinion, that don't help us to find the best way to create this story in 21st century. But it's only my opinion. There are much more different perspective in the society of museologists in Poland. But coming back to your book, because more of this museums are touching the category like victim and loss. We are victims. We are suffering in the past, and we lost something after that experience. I would like you to ask how Museum of Communism changed the meaning of this type of concept, because one thing is using property words, and another thing is how we using these words. So how we using categories like victim and loss in the Museum of Communism. What new this kind of using bring to the discourse of memory field?
Yeah, another excellent question, Beata. Thank you. My first answer would be that one of the new concepts comes in Neringa Klumbite's chapter on the museum in Vilnius, the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, now called that from the Museum of Genocide. And that's the title of her chapter is called Sovereign Pain. And she talks about how pain, that is effective memory, has shaped the way in which post-communist Lithuanian nationhood and Lithuanian sovereignty has developed. That being said, again, you're absolutely right that some of these museums, when we visit them as scholars, we wish something else was there. Of course, we're best perhaps at being critical of things that exist. One of the ways I wanted this book to operate is to avoid that when possible, or as a defining concept, and instead look at what actually happened as opposed to what we wish had happened. And in looking at what actually happened in terms of the way memory was worked in these museums might help us understand the process a little more and what might come later. Because museums, again, the beauty of using museums as a focal point is that museums always change. Not always because of political pressures, but because things seem old and stale. You want something new, and you react to new ways in which people approach the past or want the past to handed to them or developed in a museum. Sometimes hands-on type things. There's several museums that are discussed in the book that specifically want hands-on, so-called hands-on objects there, so that you can touch the past or engage with it in very active ways. And not just passive ways. But to get to your question a little bit more in depth, victimization was the main issue or problem of all of the countries after 1989 and 1991 that they've had to work through. How do we understand our past? How do we engage with this notion that so many people thought we were victims? Drakulik in her novel about the guided tour through the Museum of Communism tackled the subject quite well. The mouse that runs through the Prague Museum of Communism warns against the tendency there, at least as the mouse, I guess, or she thought, the tendency to treat the recent past as one where everyone is a victim, as opposed to where, as she says, most of us just complied in order to survive. That's not so heroic. But I think that there is an emerging sense that this story, that is the story that we, an entire nation, were entirely victims of an occupying regime, needs to be wrestled with a little more in depth. So, I'm thinking here of, we hosted the writer Julius Šukas, who's Canadian Lithuanian, in her book Siberian Exile, which she initially wrote to tell the story of her grandmother who was deported to Siberia. So that is part of the story, in fact. But in researching her family history, she realized that her grandfather was a participant in the Holocaust, that is, he murdered Lithuanian Jews. So the book is about this bifurcated memory and this bifurcated story just in one family. That is, how one family contains victims and victimizers. And I think that story is becoming more public. Also, Silvia Foti wrote a recent book about her Lithuanian grandfather, who was also worked with the Nazis. And that can be contrasted so that, again, there's a spectrum here, this growing awareness that focusing entirely on victimization isn't doing justice to the past, that might have done so in the 90s and early 2000s, but no longer is, could be contrasted with the way in which the Lonsky Prison Museum in Lviv, which I wrote about, engages in what I call memory laundering. That is, Stepan Bandera is presented there as a victim alongside Soviet dissidents such as Vyacheslav Chornovil and Irina Sinek. So that is, he's made to seem, and literally on the walls, that there's posters of people who are imprisoned there, that Bandera is included with Soviet dissidents as if they're all the same, and very little context is provided beyond that, which is what I call memory laundering. Much in the way that, like, the I don't know, the temple in Tokyo, Japan, that contains the Japanese war dead, but also includes several war criminals are remembered there. That's another form of memory laundering. And instead, I guess maybe the next step, or perhaps what will happen in this decade and beyond, is something that the mouse in Draculich's story wants, which is that objects that more and more reveal these shades of gray. That is the ways in which countries and peoples and families even aren't entirely victims, but they can be victimizers and victims.
I'm trying to talk more about this because I remember that when I'm working in one of historical museum in Poland and we are cooperating on a new exhibition, we started with idea that it would be a agora about discuss about the past, because nobody is perfect. Yes, and of course our hero also wasn't perfect. He made a lot of mistakes, and at the end of this process, after 10 years, we finished with place which could be treated like a place of cult of this person. So we tried to, but we didn't finish at that point where we started. And I know that time helped us to coming back from to this moment when in the past happened something tragical. Post-memory category is very helpful in that process. On the other hand, we created a place which today's propose us coming with some version of the past and is staying with us, this version, this way of thinking of what happened in the past, and created our reflection about the past, which is not critical kind of reflection. So we have an idea that museum could offer this, but we still couldn't find in a public place because it's hard to use it in a practical way. I really don't have a lot of possibility to meet this place with this idea in practical way in a museum in Poland. So so between this idea to create a possibility to talk about the past in new way, we have something which is described in your book as manipulation of memory. That we couldn't trust to the end this kind of story because it is a field of memory, not of history. So it's subjective, full of emotions. It's hard to be familiar with this kind of presenting very hard sometimes part of our own story. Could you say about something more about the responsibility of this kind of museum, social responsibility, because it touched the ethical mission of this kind of institution. Nowadays, I can discuss about ethical of people who working in museum. It is still open discussion. On the other hand, we have situation like this, which was described in your book, where ethical, it is a question. It is an open question for me after this visiting of whole of this museums. What do you think about this?
Yeah, tough question to answer. Thank you. I'm reminded in your story about Poland that you opened with here of the ongoing battle, I suppose, over what to do with the Enola Gay here in the United States. So the Enola Gay is the airplane that dropped the first atomic weapon on Japan in World War II. And in the 1990s, the Enola Gay was going to go on display in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. So this is now 50 years almost after the end of World War II. And the idea was that, it's finally time that we can contextualize this plane and what it means. That is to say, why the decision was made to drop the atomic bomb, but also what happened when the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. Of course, how many civilians were killed. And it ran up against all kinds of politics to the point where the entire planned exhibit for the Enola Gay was scrapped. It didn't go on display at all. It's now actually near where I live in Dayton, Ohio, in the Air Force Museum, which is actually a pretty decent museum, but it's just there. The plane is there, and there's only one sign on it that explains in very brief terms what this plane was. So in other words, it takes time, even in so-called healthy democracies, to think through some of the more problematic aspects of the past, which might help us explain why in Poland especially, the chapter I wrote on the Uprising Museum, which is only the 1944 uprising, not the 1943 ghetto uprising, focuses on a very particular element of Polish history that is used to explain how Poland made it through the communist period. That is to say that the spirit of 1944 lived on in all Poles, is the way in which this museum taps into emotions and tries to provoke an emotional response, one that the Law and Justice Party and the Institute of National Remembrance helped sponsor. The same is true of the planned World War II museum in Gdansk, which actually has a similar story to the Enola Gay exhibit. That is, it was planned as this European-wide museum that could finally examine all kinds of aspects of World War II and the ways in which people behaved in Europe in World War II, including, but not limited to, the massacre in Jedwabne that has provoked quite a response in Poland. And then instead it became much more of a patriotic museum, sponsored by Law and Justice and the Institute of National Remembrance that supports a particular regime and the correct and patriotic story. And one of the concepts I use in the book about this is that these museums operate in the way that Paul Williams wrote about in his memorial museums, that places should have a moral framework in how they narrate traumatic histories, in this case, national suffering, but also provoke an emotional reaction. Paul Williams isn't saying they should do it. It's just he's saying what has happened. But again, I have two thoughts here, two further thoughts. One is the sovereign pain that I mentioned about Zilnius's Museum of Occupation and Freedom Fights has evolved in its presentation. There are now rooms in the museum, and in fact, this happened while Neringa was writing the chapter, so she had to alter it a bit. Dedicated to the Holocaust and to the persecution of Roma as well. So, they're included now in this museum. One would think that more and more rooms of that type will be added to the museum. It's also truthful, at least, that it relies on facts and on real objects, even if it still focuses primarily on Lithuanians as victims and sufferers. And maybe the second thought I had, I have two more thoughts. One is that we ought to also look at these museums within history as well, back to my own training as a historian. So, the book is about 25 to 30 years after communism, how countries have thought about their past and institutionalized them in the form of museums. We might remind ourselves that the NBC miniseries Holocaust, which came out in the US in 1978, I was 6 years old, I didn't see it, and then was aired in West Germany in 1979, which scholars of German memory after World War II have pointed to this airing of this American television series as a powerful agent to get people to think more about the Holocaust and the way in which they did or didn't participate or remain complicit or complied with the regime. That was 35 years after the war, yeah. that this series aired that provoked another thought process in Germany. So we're still not at that moment yet when dealing with the end of communism. We're not yet at that moment in dealing with the Enola Gay in America. And that my last thought then is that, people, we still have to see individuals as individuals. They visit these places. They might buy into the dominant narrative of problematic places like the Gdansk World War II Museum, but then they might also, or the Enola Gay on display here at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, but they might also want to learn further. They might see it and want more. I mean, I think that's a lot of people want that. And then in that way, they get engaged with a more critical approach to the past and the way it's displayed in museums. I don't think we all think of museums as being the end all and be all of memory or history. That they're a first step toward it and toward understanding of it.
We had a big change in Poland in educational in museum 10 years ago, and after this change, a lot of museums decided to be more critical, especially in educational fields. On the other hand, these educational meetings are in some kind of institutions, in some kind of museums. So if we meet with this if we meet in this institution with a very very political point of view, or we couldn't use these tools in the right way. It doesn't work. It couldn't be outside of museum. It should be cooperated with the permanent exhibition which offered museum, and we still have a problem, a lot of problems between organization of museum and people who trying to change this field to the space where we can discuss using different kind of perspective. It is still something which doesn't work, and it doesn't work especially when we touching this history from so short time from the past. It is too close to us to have the good perspective in which way we should present it, this part of our story. So we touching in that way the very important for me role of a modern museum, which is based on trust to this institution. Could we trust Museum of Communism? Could we trust what they offered to us? This full of emotional, not always showing all part of the past, sometimes showing only several of them in some special way of presenting. What do you think about trusting museums like that? Because it is still an institution which play a big role in public space.
Yeah, another good question. It's hard to answer, like how one gauges trust, right, amongst the population, especially in some cases where we can't really get to and talk to people, Russia, of course, or Ukraine, because Russia's invaded Ukraine. But you know, I guess I will answer it by in another couple ways. So one is that it's true that most of these museums have educational wings to them, that is a purpose to them, and some of them are there's a spectrum here. There's some are very problematic. That is, the Warsaw Uprising Museum tends to, all their lectures and other public-facing projects tend to reinforce this patriotic narrative that supplemented Law and Justice and the Institute for National Remembrance. So there's a comic book contest every year for artists to draw a comic that represents the spirit of this museum. Yeah, right. And I talk about it in my chapter. And there are movies that are sponsored the museum that, you know, again, sort of place focus on the 1944 uprising. But it's also worth saying that that museum, while it's the one covered in the book, is one of many sites of remembrance in Warsaw today that you know better than I, Beata. But there's a new Jewish museum in Warsaw. There's a very extensive network of memory sites devoted to the ghetto. You can walk the entire outline of the ghetto in Warsaw now. There's an entire street within the former ghetto that is left as is, so that you can, with pictures of former residents on the buildings there. There are sites dedicated to the deportation of Polish Jews to Treblinka, all within the same, you know, rough space that the Uprising Museum operates in. So, you know, one doesn't only have to go to the Uprising Museum and feel as though this is the only way to get a version of the past, and therefore trust the way in which the past has been remembered. And then, you know, also I haven't talked about the Hall of Everyday Life. There's two chapters, one on Germany and one on the Czech Republic. Yeah, we're both are privately run, that focus on everyday objects, and they too provoked a lot of discussion. So they, you know, to their drawback, to their opponents, they were often charged with evoking some sort of restorative nostalgia, the kind Svetlana Boym talks about in her influential book. That is the idea of working through the past so that you could restore it in some way. That's what critics of the DDR museum, which was focused entirely on objects, Spreewald pickles or driving the Trabant in their machine that you can drive in there, as being some path toward restorative nostalgia, whereas other people thought it was, sites where they preserve lost histories and evoke at worst reflective nostalgia, that is working through the past in powerful ways. And of course, the DDR Museum in Berlin is one site that is devoted to the communist era, the other being the Stasi Museum. So you can visit both and get perhaps a full range, and therefore trust both the state in promoting the Stasi Museum and private run museums such as the DDR Museum. And the Prague Museum is perhaps an even better example. That is, it went from a upstairs ramshackle museum that famously was advertised as, above the McDonald's next to the casino in the center of Prague, and now has this brand spanking new building that's quite enormous, that preserves the everyday life focus of the original museum while also adding more exhibits to repression, and with new signage. And there it is. I suppose the conclusion here is that all point to the understanding about this process of remembrance, how it evolves, that exhibits can be added to, supplemented, have new signage. And that's true of the section on rotating exhibits. The Tallinn Occupation Museum, which is now that its original creators had closed for a year so that it could move away from occupation and suffering as its sole focus to include freedom, and the way in which freedom operates as a fairly nuanced, amorphous concept. And then, Katrin Gottfredson's chapter on the Stalin Museum, which she calls a museum of a museum. That is, the original Soviet era museum is still there, but there's also a repression room. So you get two different views there. And one hopes that leads to greater trust of these museums.
This is a wonderful situation when we have a possibility to choose which kind of museum we would like and why. If we would like to go this way of nostalgia because we would like to share something from our past with our family, for example, grandfather with his grandson, and say, it was my world in the past. I grew up in that way, not like you today. Yes, it is something very important in the field of memories, to build a connection between different kind of generations. On the other hand, I heard the last time that were a question about communism. So it's not only nostalgia, but new generation who doesn't know the way of living in communism times, would like to live in that time. Would like to create the world in the same way because they fascinating about something from that period of the time. And it is still next question what we could do in that way, because coming back to the communist time from people who lived in this period isn't so interesting. I don't want to come back to this period. I grew up in this period. I remember something from the past, from my childhood, and I wouldn't. And I'm starting to afraid when I listening stories like that somebody will see much more younger, who will create it our future more than I in several years, prefer still alive like that from the past. So this is a question about authority of museum, because by creation some needs. not only connected with the history, with some baggage from the past, like this suitcase about which you mentioned at the beginning of the book, because it is something from my past, and then after several years, I would like to come back to this from some reasons, which is important maybe only for me. On the other hand, they created some needs nowadays. So do you think that Museum of Communism help us to thinking about future in the correct form, to propose some new version of life, using this lesson from the past in the correct way? Could this kind of news help us in this process, or maybe not? What do you think?
Well, yeah, you're asking me to go against my stated policy as a historian of looking at what was remembered as opposed to the way we want to remember it. But I'll answer the question nonetheless, and that is to say that far more dangerous is to allow objects and memories to remain in closets and suitcases where grievances get nurtured more than historical understanding. Instead, make it public, have people engage with it. Think about the ways that the past speaks to us in multiple ways, that is sometimes mediated ways, but sometimes unmediated ways, and that the past is complicated. It always is, and one hopes that these museums, and if some of them have already, will engage over time in more complex ways. And the second is about nostalgia. So nostalgia can operate in multiple directions too. I mean, I think we all tend to think of it as if when someone's nostalgic for the past, particularly the communist past, that it means that they want it restored somehow. But I think the dominant way nostalgia in that way functions is that it helps people work through the fact that the past is past, that it can't come back. One feels nostalgic. So if I feel nostalgic for my childhood in the 1980s, it's not that I want the 1980s to return. It just is that I'm acknowledging, in fact, that they can't return, and that there are parts of it that weren't so terrible. Movies and a lot of that deals with, I don't know, popular culture objects. So in the case of the communist museums, there's nothing inherently dangerous or bad about Spreewald pickles or the Trabant or a Soviet arcade game like Sea Battle, or an old Soviet Kopek that one can use in the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games. So I don't think that children or young people who didn't experience the communist past go there and play these games or drive on the Trabant simulator or taste Spreewald pickles and want communism in return. I think it's a way of getting to the gray areas that Drakulich wants. That is, that people mostly survived, they got by, they lived, however, in whatever complexities that meant. So yeah, maybe that's a positive note.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. It's the end question from me, but I think there is something on the chat. I'm not sure, Maria.
I can't see yet, but maybe the audience is waiting, and maybe someone would prefer to ask with the voice, so to say. So
I see that Diana has writing a proposal to a question. Diana, could you ask your question?
Thank you for allowing me to speak and ask questions. Stephen, this is a very interesting presentation, and your book is so fascinating. So admittedly, I haven't looked at it yet, but I do plan on looking at it. And I did look at, and I have a copy of Slavenka Drakulich's book on the museums of communism, which I purchased at the Hungarian Museum. So this is super interesting. And so I come, like you, I'm Canadian. So I come from North America, but I also have this Eastern European background where my parents were from the former Yugoslavia. And so my attempt or my goal is to go throughout Eastern Europe and experiment or look at many of these museums. So I'm so glad that you've written a book on this. So actually, I guess my question is a little bit twofold, which is that I think we talked about, I guess, and I apologize, I came in a few minutes late, but victimization and things like that. And so I wonder if you have had any experiences of this, or, I mean, my parents always talk about communism in very fond terms. Just everything, everybody had everything. They came from a small village in Bosnia. You always had food, but you didn't necessarily, of course, have all of the clothing and things like that. There weren't luxuries. And so I wondered about this, if what your opinions are, and I think you touched on this a little bit, just in terms of nostalgia, just related to your youth and how that relates to, museum work and history and things like that. I always got the impression that I think my parents very much were very much nostalgic about communism, but in part it was because they grew up in it and they were younger. So you had a semblance of, well, things are easier because you have your parents to take care of you. But I do have to say, even my father grew up just during and after World War II, and his parents were both killed during World War II in a village in Bosnia. But he still has fond memories and still thinks communism is a great place to be or live in. But at the same time, then I wonder, given that you're in Ohio, right? And me being in Canada, right? I do wonder what you think about this in terms of, is this the same sense of nostalgia as people in my area as the 1950s, American-Soviet relations? And I do wonder if this is something that you can think is possibly akin to people right now, maybe of a certain age, thinking that the 1950s were the best place to live in or the best times to live in, even though women and, visible minorities had zero rights at all. So I wonder if there's a comparison there, and I'm thinking of that, and if you can comment on that. But then the other thing I'm thinking of is looking at your book. So again, being a bit biased here, coming from the former Yugoslavia, did you do any, and I apologize because again, I came a few minutes late, did you look at any museums in the former Yugoslavia? There's a Tito Museum, for example, which of course focuses on communism. Did you consider including them, or was it those museums, or was it, possibly, the communist, that museum, Yugoslavia is the third way. And so maybe you wouldn't have included it. So there's that. And then final question is, I'm wondering, what is the best museum that you can possibly recommend, particularly for somebody, I mean, I've been to a few, but for somebody from, say, traveling a bit further, what is the one museum that you would recommend, if anything? Thank you. And thank you again. This was very enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. Great questions all. I'll tackle all three of them.
Thank you.
By the way, I should say, one of the great joys of doing this book, so Indiana University Press, with whom I've worked many times, for once when I published this book, asked me if I would be willing to contact people to get blurbs on the back, which at first I thought, why would the author want? That seems weird, right? But then I decided, you know what, I'm going to write Slavenka Drakulic herself and ask her if she'd be willing to read this book and write a blurb for it. And in fact, she did. So the book is blurred by Drakulic on the back, which is, I know, I look at this now and think, wow, isn't that great? But that's not an answer to your question. So the first, I'll answer the second question first, and that is, there aren't any Yugoslav museums in the book, in part for reasons you said, that is, it was the third way, which means that I think remembrance in former Yugoslav museums would need to be contextualized and written about a little bit differently than in the other cases, in part because of the way Yugoslav communism functioned and the way that the wars of the 1990s affected memories of the communist period, which helps explain, I think, your parents' reaction, and which gets me to your first question. So I see a difference here, that your parents' nostalgia is the sort of nostalgia that most of us feel, or at least many of us feel, when thinking about childhood. So I mentioned the 1980s. I was 10, 11 years old when the movie Red Dawn came out in the midst of then President Reagan's revived Cold War. I went and saw it in the theater. I loved it. I'm sure if I watched it again right now with my kids, I would still love it, knowing full well that it was a movie partly sponsored by the CIA to tell a very particular story about how we're in danger of being invaded by the Cubans and the Soviets. I guess I don't see that as problematic unless it moves toward being operated by a political party or a political entity that tries to get people to vote a certain way based on this more problematic understanding of the past. We might call that the Make America Great Again movement, MAGA, right? Because we're seeing it right here in the United States. So there's a difference between individual personal memories of the past and the way we approach it and the way in which they can be used to harness political movements. And, you know, a short anecdote here, my colleague Venelin Ganev, who is Bulgarian and who is anything but, you know, soft or has anything but fond memories of communism and has written a lot about the dangers that Beata spoke about and the dangers you hinted at, Diana. You know, we visited this Bulgarian Museum of Socialist Objects on the side of a road outside of Sofia together. And here is this person who has written about the dangers of using memories about communism for political purposes, who saw the same refrigerator he had as a child, or the television that he watched the 1974 World Cup on, and got quite excited about it. So that I think speaks to my main point about the way nostalgia can operate. Now that's allowed me to think a little bit further about the best museum to visit. I would say two museums are worth visiting because they speak to some of the issues that I raised today and in the book. One would be the Vilnius Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, because it's one that has evolved perhaps the most, so that you could read the chapter Neringa Klumbite talks about, or, you know, read her chapter and then go visit it and see how much, if anything, has changed. But also because it's indicative of many of the museums in the book that started out devoted solely to victimization and genocide and have slowly, you know, adapted and included new exhibits. And then the same goes for the Museum of Communism in Prague, which it isn't my favorite museum per se. I mean, but it's one that has probably changed the most. So it's gone the opposite way, I suppose. That is, it started out as a more everyday life museum, much like this Museum of Socialist Objects in Bulgaria, and has become more structured and started to include stories of repression along with stories of everyday life. So, you know, I think they capture the way in which museums evolve and the way in which cultures of remembrance take place and develop.
Thank you very much, Steve. We have still two persons who
I can
would
see
like to
one
ask
with-
you.
Yeah, two questions. So Douglas, please, your question.
Hi, thanks, Stephen, for the book. Really, well, I just downloaded it today. So, and I just got a notification for this seminar, whatever it is today as well. So, perfect timing, I would say. Actually, one thing that interests me a lot is when those memories, those traumatic memories become narrated in museums, yeah? They're often placed in a very nationalizing context usually without any regards to the regional. For example, how can KGB experiences be really relevant to Lithuanians that are from Klaipėda, for example, because during that time it was considered to be a part of Germany. And so I always wonder, like, what do you think about this when you know, certain events, like for example in Poland, the Warsaw Uprising Museum. In all honesty, based on what I understand from people I ask in Poland, if you're not from Warsaw, it's not relevant to you. Nobody cares. Everybody thinks that's a Warsaw thing. And at the same time, in Poland, you have historical events such as expulsion from the former Eastern borderlands. They become, in some sense, narrated into the national story as well, even though most of Poland, honestly, could not care less or could not feel there's any relevance to this event. So I guess it's not really a question, but more like my question would be, what is your opinion on this? How regional becomes national, how national becomes regional, and what kind of implications does it have when it comes to new museum narratives that will come out in the future, because the museum narrative will change as the people change and, you know, politics change and so on and so forth. And for me, having worked on Polish museums, I think it's very relevant for me. So yeah.
Yeah, good question, Douglas, and good observation. And that's one of the fundamental problems that is addressed in the book across multiple chapters, and that is the way in which many of these museums nationalize spaces that were multi-ethnic and multi-confessional across time and make them into stories that are only relevant to the dominant national group of that state. So, you know, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia being examples of this, but also Poland. So these are places that at the beginning of the 20th century were multi-ethnic And by the end of the 20th century, were quite homogenous because of the processes of the 20th century. That is because of the wars and genocides of the 20th century. That being said, so yes, that's a problem. And, we could also say in reference to the Uprising Museum in Warsaw that you mentioned too, Douglas, that museum in part grew out of an aggrieved notion that too many people in the West only know the 1943 ghetto uprising and don't know the real uprising, I put that in scare quotes, that involved ethnic Poles, although it didn't just involve ethnic Poles, it involved the population of Warsaw in 1944, some of whom were Jewish. So that's problematic. One way out of that, and one way that has affected the museum in Tallinn and the museum in Vilnius, is that when the former Baltic states joined the EU, there are laws about commemorating the past and commemorating the Holocaust, particularly that have to be applied in spaces like the museum in Vilnius and the museum in Tallinn. And both of those museums have done so, at least to, we could argue about whether they've done enough, but they're there, it's present. The same as the Ninth Fort Museum, not in the book, but I mentioned earlier, outside of Kaunas, which has, complied with EU regulations and now has a very layered description of the past. It still starts with, and it primarily focuses on deportation of Lithuanians to Siberia, but there are entire rooms in that fort devoted to Russian imperial troops, devoted to the way in which Lithuanian Jews were rounded up and executed right outside that fort in the early weeks of World War II. So it's layered, and I think that's the model perhaps that might stick if we want to be positive, or maybe if we want to be negative, we can see the way in which the aggrieved memories in Poland have kept law and justice in power.
Yeah, I mean, they need this kind of courage to really somewhat bring the country together and give a national story that defines them as Poles, which I always find very interesting, because so many of the historical events that are being narrated in Polish museums, often they don't really, not only do they not relate to all of Poland, only certain specific regions in particular, ethnic Poles nonetheless, but they also relate to certain social classes as well, which would not have been any form relevant or relatable to a common everyday Pole. And yet, the museums are still trying to make stories out of this as something in which everybody can identify with. So yeah, I just find it very fascinating.
Yeah, if I could add, not in the book, but if I can add, in Krakow, if you were to go there, the city museum network in Krakow is actually quite interesting in many ways, because they run a multiple museums in the city that speak to multiple pasts. One of them is the Oskar Schindler Museum, which I visited thinking, I don't know, I guess I had a negative idea when I got there, thinking, oh my gosh, it's just going to celebrate this movie, not the actual past. But in fact, it's a quite good museum that runs through the way in which Krakow experienced Nazi occupation, and the way in which Schindler was just one of many, people in Krakow working within the occupation system to save people's lives, and that there were people who didn't. There's in fact a room at the end that has a list of people who are on Yad Vashem's righteous list, and the list of people who collaborated with the Nazis. So you get this story here. But then the very same museum network runs a museum in Nowa Huta, the socialist suburb of Krakow, which is almost entirely, well, it's entirely a museum of rotating exhibits. That is, it changes across time, and it focuses mostly on everyday life. That is, the people who actually lived in Nowa Huta, who were primarily workers, and the ways they understood their lives. I mean, they're meaning that there are, exhibits that have been there about Catholicism in the region. It's where John Paul II started out as a priest, but then also I actually attended an exhibit that was devoted entirely to communist era popular music that was produced in Nowa Huta. So that's the equivalent of, say, Spreewald Pickles or the Trabant, right? It's something that happened in the past that bound people together, that was associated with the communist era, but isn't entirely something to feel negative about.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And we still have questions, but we need to ask Steve and Beata whether you have time to answer all the questions that we still have. So what about time?
Sure, I have a little more time. Yeah.
Okay.
Me too, because I see Samantha. I
Yeah.
don't know
Yeah.
if there's many more, so maybe we take place for Samantha, and later we'll check what's going on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samantha. Please, your question.
Thank you. Thank you for fitting me in. That was a really interesting talk, very insightful. I'm currently doing my PhD specifically about museums of communism. So your book has obviously been a huge help. But it's a lot of things you've been saying and about the memory and how memory is used today has been quite fascinating. And it's interesting because I'm working, one of the museums, one of my case studies is the Museum of Life Under Communism in Warsaw, which I noticed either most people have never been to or do not know exists, even though it's one of the few. I write in my thesis that it's the only one in Warsaw completely dedicated to it. And there's a lot in there to say about it. And I know that's not the point of this, but it is interesting the way that it is a private institution and was founded by people who are tour companies. And so obviously it does have a very nostalgic everyday take on it. But it was quite interesting of what Douglas is saying as well, and how you answered that about actually it's what I've concluded is that its overarching message is still very much about the Polish spirit and the Polish sense of national identity. And actually they are almost taking, it's one small museum in Warsaw, a very private institution that has managed to nonetheless take on this entire unifying, universalizing narrative about what it means to be Polish in communism. And so I guess it's one of the things I wanted to ask is if you've been, and if you have an opinion on that, because I really can't find anyone who's been to that, especially Poles. But then it also kind of, the second question goes a little bit to that trouble that I have, which is finding Poles that have been there, because a lot of people seem to want to write it off. But the reason I ask this is because my focus is specifically on how foreign tourists engage with this museum and how these museums can tell these stories when their primary audience is not, for example, Poles or not Czechs, which is my other case study is the Museum of Communism in Prague. And because you've spoken a lot about the way that these museums embody what the locals want to remember and how they want to represent their past and how they wish that it had been remembered. But I'm wondering if maybe if any of your the authors who wrote for this book, or if any of your experience, if you've come up against how these museums want to present themselves to outsiders, and if they take any of that into consideration, because I found in my own work that a lot of these museums have to do with national identity and that sense of wanting to build a nation out of 1989, essentially. And yeah, so just kind of how you find that the drive to get tourists in affects how they remember the past.
Yeah, great question, Samantha. I'm really pleased to learn that you're writing your dissertation thesis on this subject. Don't be too mean to me when you write about it, but please critique the book. I have not visited the Museum of Communism that you mentioned in Warsaw, although I know of it. And I didn't commission an article about it, mostly because we, I already had 14 articles commissioned, but also because no one had visited it. So that's a way of saying maybe you'll write about it for my website, and then you can write even more about it in your dissertation chapter. That being said, I mean, my response to that particular museum, I thought it in my head of Steve Kotkin's great book about the collapse of communism, where he said, most of us have this idea that Poland was the rule and not the exception in the way communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. That is to say that people took to the streets. There was this long-standing sense of nationhood and aggrieved notions of nationhood in particular. Whereas, as Kotkin, I think, argues persuasively, Poland was the exception, not the rule. That is, most countries, even in 1989, including Czechoslovakia, when Václav Havel was released from prison again in early 1989 and held a demonstration, only a couple thousand people attended. But by the end of the year, there were 200,000 people in the streets of Prague. So that there's something else that went on in other places where Poland isn't the best exemplar of that process. And I say that because I think Polish museums of memory fit the exception, not the rule category as well. Another response to your question. So Muriel Blave's chapter on the Museum of Communism in Prague is the one that most addresses your questions about the fact that it is aimed primarily at tourists and not Czechs or Slovaks for that matter. And Mate Zambori's article about the House of Terror in Budapest is similar to it. That is, those two places of all the ones in the book are mostly aimed at foreign audiences and therefore have to be considered differently, perhaps, I don't think it's, that's an area that perhaps I wish that someone had written a little bit more about, but maybe that's now your job. That is the difference between these museums that are tourist spots, dark tourist sites, and also the ways in which private museums function differently than public museums. I think could even though it runs through the book, could be explored a little bit more in depth. I think these are issues that some good scholar like you needs to investigate a little bit more.
I could add only about Polish museums that we have several museums about communism, and all of them are private, not public, and so they need to find some possibility to function without any dotation from government. So first of all, they are for public, for people who will come to them, because without that, they couldn't survive. And after pandemic, there are a lot of problems with places like that. There are also in Śląsk, places like that. So Samantha, if you need some more information, please write to me and I help you. And there are 2 books in Poland dedicated with stories. One is produced by Łukasz Kowiecki, who wrote a story about museum which couldn't be opened, and it was in center of Warsaw, near a Palace of Culture and Science, and before and on the plus before that very huge building in the center of Warsaw, there was an idea in 19th to open the first museum of communism under this plus. And it never happened. This book was published 1 year ago, and it is a really amazing story why it couldn't happen in 19th in Warsaw. And second person is Anna Ziembińska-Witek, who described more examples from Poland. He's a historian from Lublin, and maybe she could help you in your work or inspire to something, or I don't know. It is something from me to you.
Thank you very much, both of you. That's quite interesting. I'll have to look up those books. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if we have for a few more minutes, I would like to ask my question, if you don't mind. The question is somehow related to that that Beata asked about responsibility of museums, because what do you feel? Do museums play some role, or if they do, what kind of role they play in commodification of memory? Especially of memory of the difficult past, in terms of museum shops, because in some museums I could see, of course, I didn't visit all the museums that were described in the book, but in some museums I could see a picture of Stalin on the bottles, on their smoking pipes, whatever. So they sell, how to say, the difficult past. So what do you feel about that?
Yes, that's a very difficult question to answer, and you're right. I mean, I think of the time I went to Krakow the first time, and I guess I hadn't thought of this before, but if you visit that city, and one should, there are signs everywhere for tours to Auschwitz, and it's very disconcerting, right? You're walking through this incredibly beautiful city, and around you are signs, cheapest rates to Auschwitz, and then you visit, if you do visit, and you of course realize that there are gift shops there and cafes in Auschwitz. They don't commodify the horrific past there, but right, we expect certain things from museums and sites of memory, including gift shops and cafes. And in this particular case, traumatic histories, KGB museums and things like that. What do we make of the way the past can be commodified? I don't have good answers for that, Marie. It's a great question, right? Other than I reached for my shelf and pulled out the communist era toilet paper I bought at the Museum of Communism in Prague, mostly just to show my students, because it's sold there. It's not actually from the communist era, it's reproductions of the toilet paper in the communist era, meant to suggest how flimsy toilet paper was in the communist era. I don't know what to do with that either, other than these this is part of the story of these museums that isn't covered in the book that maybe someone needs to take up. What does it mean to commodify the past, sell images of Stalin, or sell books that focus entirely on patriotic nationalist histories that are harnessed in these museums? Board games at the museum, the Uprising Museum in Warsaw, for example, that where you play at the past.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I can't see more questions or raised hands. Well, it seems that, we're almost perfect in time that we promised at the beginning. So the discussion was so fascinating. Thank you very much, Beata and Steve, for your presentation, participation in the discussion. Thank you that you agreed to be here today. And thank you to the audience for your interest and for your questions, of course. Thank you very much. And this is just for the information that the video record of this seminar will be on YouTube, the PoSoCoMeS YouTube channel. So their newsletter will be sent to the PoSoCoMeS mailing list. So you can easily find their link to their channel and to this video. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Beata.
Thank you very much for interesting meeting.